Thank you. Our next speaker is Advaith. Advaith is a junior from Dallas, Texas, double majoring in political economy and Asian studies on the pre-med track. His passions bridge research, medicine, and Indian healthcare, with research ranging from theoretical chemistry to the role of neuronal structures in stress response, and published research focusing on improving tuberculosis diagnosis abroad. Outside the lab and the classroom, he empowers young students through local STEM initiatives and still somehow finds a way to train for a marathon this summer. When he's not studying or running, you might find him playing frisbee, producing music, or exploring the streets of New Orleans. Please join me in welcoming Advaith.
For thousands of years, people have experienced what we might call out-of-body experiences. Altered states of consciousness that have been documented and venerated within Hinduism as signs of spiritual growth. These states are normal and even desirable within certain traditions, so they're neither irrational nor delusional. They represent people's deep connection with God and their understanding of the natural world. During my summers in India, where most of my family lives, I used to visit these ashrams and temples, where I'd observe these intense metaphysical states firsthand. I observed sannyasis, or saints, immersed in worship, their devotion seemingly consuming their entire being. They would sit at the side of temples and chant the Lord's name in rhythmic voices, seemingly impervious to the sweltering Indian heat outside. Their clothes would be soaked in sweat and dust, and these flies or insects would land on their skin, and temple goers would be walking past them back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes they'd burst into tears or break into these new compositions or songs that they wrote on the spot. And in other more extreme cases, I observed acts of self-mortification. They would pierce their lips, their skin, and their backs with metal skewers and hooks. Their commitment to feeling God's presence was absolute. Now, bear in mind, whenever I first saw these states, I was really surprised, and I would even ask my mom, who would accompany me to these temples, were these people not crazy or irrational, or was there not something wrong with them? But the more conversations I had, the more I observed, and the more I learned that this was something different. This was an embodied experience of bhavam, an emotional state so overwhelming that it dissolves bodily limitation in pursuit of divine connection. And bhavam isn't unique to Hinduism by any means. We see these altered states of consciousness documented across cultures and religions. For example, in Islam, Sufi mystics engage in these ecstatic whirling movements with their hands in the air as they pray in an act known as wajid. Similarly, in Christianity, many saints have documented intense spiritual visions. In St. Julian of Norwich's case, she documents and recollects reimagining Jesus to be the sole mother of all of mankind, or as she states, Jesus is a true mother of life and of all things. Now, if we read Julian of Norwich's characterization of Jesus, or we see bhavam or wajid, we see that these elevated states of consciousness are not exclusive to one culture or religion. They've been documented across cultures and time periods, each with their own understanding and terminology. Okay, now I want everybody here to do me a favor. I want you all to close your eyes and imagine somebody on our own university's campus exhibiting these behaviors. Ecstatic whirling movements with their hands in the air, loudly proclaiming their love for God, bursting into tears as they pierce their face and body with metal skewers and hooks. How would we perceive them? Or instead of one person, what if it was a large group of people? Now likely, we wouldn't consider them spiritually enlightened or divine. We probably want to diagnose them with some sort of neuropsychiatric disorder, or at the very least, we'd call them crazy, take photos or videos of them, and post them on our social medias. Why is this? These intense emotional expressions often deviate from Western behavioral ideals, where emotional restraint is valued. But in other cultures or traditions, like what I've seen in India, these behaviors aren't questioned as much because they align with long-standing spiritual and cultural traditions. Reactions, labels, norms, and stigma are constantly changing and evolving given the time, the place, the culture, and historical circumstances. And this pattern of identifying the all is not new by any means. In fact, when colonial governments first arrived in India, they dismissed indigenous understandings of science, of the mind and body and consciousness. In fact, Thomas Babington Macaulay, the British official in charge of restructuring colonial India's education system, once very infamously proclaimed that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole of the native literature of India and Arabia. These colonial attitudes didn't just undermine Indian philosophy. They essentially redefined which emotional experiences were considered legitimate and illegitimate. So bhavam, which was once seen as this beautiful metaphysical state that people yearned to achieve, became reclassified as hysteria, a disorder that was primarily attributed to women and the colonized. Western psychiatry created a false dichotomy: rationality versus irrationality, or order versus chaos. And because bhavam didn't neatly fit within his framework, it was stigmatized and pathologized. An anthropologist who I've had the privilege of meeting, Dr. Sarah Pinto at Tufts University, has conducted extensive research over South Asia. And her research looks at just this. She discusses how hysteria has often been incorrectly diagnosed in South Asia, where colonial medicine has often used gendered and racialized frameworks in order to push for these disorders. Now, it's important to note that Indian doctors often did resist this framework, favoring a more holistic and culturally inclusive approach to the human mind and consciousness. But as y'all can guess, this overwhelming dominance of these Western neuropsychiatric institutions in India reaffirmed and reinforced these diagnoses. Now, if we take a step back, we see that these states are neither irrational nor delusional, as I mentioned. There are these profound metaphysical states that often resist Western translation and clinical interpretation. Western neuropsychiatric paradigms want us to pathologize these emotional states. But what if we try to challenge that? See, the brain manifests itself in these incredibly complex and glorious ways that neuroscientists are just now beginning to understand. So by integrating ethical considerations, historical circumstances, and the culture and identity and belief systems of people, we help improve mental health infrastructure around the world and simultaneously expand our modern scope of understanding of the human mind and consciousness. Now, I want to be very clear with everybody here. Mental illness is real. There are people around our world suffering from significant neuropsychiatric disorders, and they deserve the appropriate care. But lumping together people with divergent emotional experiences and other people with actual mental disorders, we run the risk of completely undermining cultural influences on emotion, and sometimes even push for not only unnecessary, but harmful treatments. Now, behind me is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which some of y'all might better know as the DSM. If you don't, the DSM is a handbook used by mental health professionals to diagnose mental disorders. Research indicates how, on multiple occasions, the DSM has expanded psychiatric diagnoses into areas of normal range distress. What this has meant is that these incorrect diagnoses have undermined the integrity of the psychiatric institutions and obscured the meaning of its research results. The way I see it, the DSM serves as a safety net because mental health professionals are trained to use it to immediately pathologize these emotional states. But what if we try to challenge that? What if, instead of automatically pathologizing divergent emotional experiences, we recognize the fact that not all divergent emotional experiences need to be pathologized? With that, in the spirit of uncharted territories, I'd like to propose a new way of approaching, I would like to offer a new way of approaching neuropsychiatry as culturally influenced. I want to reiterate the necessity of integrating sociology, anthropology, culture, religion, all these studies into biomedicine to refine our diagnostic framework for mental health and mental disorder. What this means is that neuropsychiatry, which to be very clear is a field I'm as drawn to as Asian studies or anthropology or political economy, must refine its framework to be more culturally inclusive, recognizing that these divergent emotional experiences aren't symptoms of some sort of mental disorder, but rather transformative metaphysical states that deserve to be validated and respected. And I also want to note that science is constantly changing too. Let's take genetics, for example. A long time ago, A long time ago, Gregor Mendel once delineated the entire concept of dominant and recessive alleles using his P-plant experiments. So in high school, whenever I took my first ever biology class, I was taught to reduce this entire field of genetics and all these really complex inheritance patterns into this incredibly simple 2x2 grid behind me, which is known as the Punnett square. A lot has changed since then. Scientists eventually discovered that DNA was responsible for carrying the genetic information from parent to offspring. Scientists eventually discovered this whole new field of genetics that they literally called non-Mendelian genetics in order to help explain other inheritance patterns, like what we see in our blood, which is codominance. Scientists use these fundamental genetic concepts in order to conduct genetic manipulation experiments and identify heritable disorders that can be treated early on in patients. Now, the reason I bring this up is that science is constantly evolving. And if science is constantly evolving, so too should our understanding of the human mind and consciousness. One of my professors at Tulane, Dr. Andrew McDowell, once taught me the necessity of dismantling the unwillingness to accept multiple ways of knowing. So by integrating all these different spheres of knowledge or spheres of knowing the human body and mind, we move closer to a more fuller understanding of the human experience. Rationality is useful. Now, what's not useful is dismissing everything that doesn't fit neatly into our Western framework of rationality as irrational. And perhaps these bearers of these divergent emotional experiences also have something to tell us about the way they experience the world and how we might experience the world. Different knowledge infrastructures can not only coexist, but complement one another. And in that complementation, we move closer to a more nuanced understanding of what it means to think, what it means to feel, and what it means to be a human. Thank you.